So we'll get started with audio description and things, and I'll pass over to the two people from TAA. So I'm Isaac Kay-Lavelle, the research assistant at the Evidence and Insight here. I'm here primarily with Oliver Mantell, who's going to be presenting most of this. So I'll pass over to him first for, I should say my audio description. I'm a white man in my mid-20s with blonde hair, wearing a black t-shirt. So
thanks, Isaac. I swear Isaac only mentions his age just to try and get me into saying my own. But anyway, I'll leave it middle-aged white male with, now it's sunny, actually genuinely blonde hair. But yes, in a fairly plain room, yes. Back to you.
Great. So we also have with us our CEO, Anne Torreggiani, who is going to be doing a response later to questions. If you want to do a brief description.
Yes, with pleasure. I think that makes me an old woman with wearing glasses, an old white woman wearing glasses and hair sprayed back. But anyway, yes. Welcome.
Great. And also just a welcome to Ella Brown, who's joined our team today. So you'll be seeing her appear sort of in the tea breaks from now on. So I'm sure she'll be presenting the next one that we do in July that's coming up, which will be on audience behaviour, but we'll tell you more about that at the end. Great. Let's get started. That's all right. Yeah. If we want to jump to the first slide. Great. So this, as I'm sure you know, this tea breaks on interest and attendance. So we're looking at kind of the conversion between these two, and this is insights from two of the questions. This is based on our cultural participation monitor. If you're not familiar with it, it's a survey that we run sort of every quarter, every few months, asking the population sort of around 2,000 or 3,000 people about their cultural trends. And this is from Wave 7, which was last autumn. This one, which we used one that's a little bit older than our most recent one, just because it had a larger sample size of around 3,500 people. And we asked these two questions. So how interested are you in each of the following? Giving 13 cultural options, from film to dance to various different options, asking are you very interested or quite interested, and combining these two. And then we also asked which of the following have you attended in the last 12 months, to get a feel for what people are actually going to, which was a slightly expanded list of 16 options. And then we just compared them when we could, a direct comparison between the two. And all of this is then what we'll call cross-tabbed by demographic comparators, so we can look at age and various different metrics for these two questions. These are the two questions. Anything to add, Ollie? Or right.
No, I think that about covers it. So shall I jump into what it actually told us when we look? So what essentially I'm going to talk through is some things looking at the relative popularity and the relative conversion of interest into attendance by art form. And then looking at some things about sort of particular demographic splits we saw in terms of people's interests and in terms of people's engagement, and then to draw both of those together in a sort of more holistic view. And then we have a bit of conversation about some of the factors that sit around all of that. Essentially, there's going to be sort of the equivalent of 3 basic charts used on the way through. If you like, the first one, given that we're in sort of ice cream season, the first one is your vanilla chart. The second one's got a few bits of drizzle on them in terms of a few more lines. And then the final one is the one that really comes with absolutely everything on. And we'll maybe take a little bit more chewing through. So bear with us, the giant sundae is coming at the end. So without any more elaborate metaphors. So the first thing that we we're looking at is overall, if people said they were very or quite interested in different art forms. And this is across a representative sample of the whole population, and the results in themselves probably won't be a huge surprise. So the things that tend to be really popular, really widespread, so film, museums, music in a general sense, sort of that could all sorts of genres of music, essentially music except for classical music. Really high proportions of the population are interested in doing them. As you get maybe a little bit more specific, if you get more into particular art forms, it narrows down a little bit. And particularly something like children and family events, we know, yes, they're super popular for those that are in the market for them, but it's a relatively constrained chunk of the population for whom that's really relevant. We know about 1 in 3 households have children in them, and sure enough, it's around 1 in 3, so they're interested in 1 in 4. Okay. So that's the overall picture, not hugely surprising. Where it gets a little bit more interesting, I think, is when we start looking at proportion of those people who said they're interested who also actually attended it in the previous 12 months. Now, of course, we wouldn't expect everyone to, but we would maybe expect for some art forms relatively higher proportions to than others. And here's the overall picture. So the conversion rate, so the proportion of interested who said they had attended in the previous 12 months, whether that was attending several times, whether it was attending once or twice. And broadly speaking, with a couple of exceptions we'll come to, it follows the same pattern as the overall interest, which is, on the one hand, not surprising, but also I think worth a little bit of extra reflection. So lots of people are interested in film, and if you're interested in film, you're relatively likely to do it. It's relatively low cost, it's relatively widely available, it's well publicized, etc. It's a relatively easy engagement. Even if you live in rural areas and would be further away from lots of cultural infrastructure, there's often at least a cinema or Flicks in the Sticks or something available. And obviously you have a huge choice in various other places. Museums, again, often lower barriers to entry just in terms of things like cost, but also there's obviously quite a strong push in terms of family engagement and children and schools and so forth. But also it's something people often tie into holidays and so forth, so you'd expect a higher conversion rate. Notably, some of these other art forms, as you get further down the list, as well as fewer people being interested, fewer of those who are interested actually end up doing them. So again, I think if we start to distinguish between these two different aspects, it gives us some quite different thoughts about engagement and strategies and so forth. Visual arts, again, is often easier to dip in. There's less of a kind of expectation. If you commit to going to it, you're committing for a long period of time, or for for a particular cost, or it's limited to a particular time that you have to attend it. So again, it's slightly broader opportunities, slightly behind higher level of take up. And notably, we mentioned children and family arts. So relatively fewer people were that interested in doing it for obvious reasons. But if they were, it's quite a high chunk of the population are therefore then converting. So that probably makes a fair amount of sense. So that's, if you like, that's our kind of our base level in terms of the overall picture. But we then wanted to have a look and see what the different factors were that were driving how much people tended to convert. Was it certain types of people converted a higher proportion if they were interested than others? We looked at a whole host of things. One which did make quite a bit of difference was whether people feel they're relatively better off than they used to be. So we had that in as a standard question. And of course, if you're feeling like you have more money, then, sorry, I've seen a question there which we'll come back to. If you're feeling like you've got relatively more money, of course, it's easier to commit to attend, not just in terms of paying your way in, but having less pressures in your life in all sorts of other ways simultaneously. So, maybe pick up on the question I've just seen. Which was, have you also checked if those not interested attended? We did, and yes, sometimes they did. It's about 10% of engagement, I think, was picked up by those groups, fairly evenly across the board. But we have chosen just to zoom in on the people who were interested and attending, generally speaking. On the next section, we've not, just to make it simpler. But yes, so broadly speaking, different art forms, different levels of interest, levels of conversion. But when we looked at all the things that were driving higher levels of conversion, the thing that really stuck out to us was the extent to which age was important as a factor. And I know some of you who've been to previous tea breaks will have heard me talk about the importance of age in cultural engagement in various other ways previously, but it really did stand out here. It stood out in a couple of different ways. It had an impact in terms of the amount people were interested in things, and it also had an impact in terms of the conversion, albeit one of them more pronounced than the other. So, a simple measure would be just to look at what, how many different art forms people said they were interested in by age. You know, is it the case that people of different ages have just different dispositions in terms of saying they're interested? And to some extent they did. There is a bit of a difference, particularly when you get to the older age groups, which tend to have substantially lower levels of different types of culture that people say they're interested in. So it's the highest for having none or having 1 to 3. It's the lowest for having 7 to 9, 10 to 12 different art forms mentioned. Interestingly, though, it isn't the complete counter. So it's not the case that the youngest people are the opposite of that. They're actually somewhere in the middle. The group that seem to have the highest level of interest is 45 to 54, which I guess, you know, the middle-aged group. So what seems to be happening is that progressively over time, people kind of build up a range of interests, and then it kind of ebbs back out again as they get older beyond that kind of middle-aged point. So people, I guess, start experimenting, start exploring, they gather more and more things they might be interested in, and then they start to sort of zoom in on the things that they're most most personally attracted to, or best able to get to, or that fit with lifestyle or habits or social groups that kind of build up around particular types of activity and so forth. So thinking about that kind of journey that people are on could maybe inform the way we think about what we do about engaging people in arts and culture, just in terms of overall interest. So in summary, all people tend to have slightly fewer cultural interests, a bit higher middle-aged, and youngest are somewhere in between. Now I've seen another. I wonder if middle-aged people resonating hard are also interested by proxy in things their children are. That's a really interesting point. And yes, I think that probably is partly what's going on. I think what's also possibly happening is that if their children are doing things, they're getting engaged with them and it's putting them on their mental map. So a metaphor that I've used a bit in relation to this, because I don't know if anyone's played any of those computer games where there's a map that you play on, and if you've been to a certain bit of the map recently, you can see it. And if you haven't been there recently, it kind of fades out. It kind of gradually grays out, so you can only see where you've recently been. I think that kind of happens a bit with cultural engagement. So I guess if you're going to things with your children or for your children, it keeps that bit of the map lit up. So it kind of leaves it sort of slightly in your option set in a way that maybe otherwise wouldn't. So I think that might be part of what the process is. So anyway, so that's about interest. But middle-aged is 45 to 54, that kids. Yes, and by middle-aged, I think middle-age is, you see the progression upwards still through that period. And of course, I think you also get that thing that as people become, as you get the empty nest thing, you also get an opportunity for people to start exploring new different things to do, and they have more time, they have more money potentially. They're looking for other options for the next phase of life. And it does depend on the role of children, whether you have children. But we do generally see that having children boosts cultural engagement, and it boosts a range of cultural engagement. So, moving on from interest then to what people actually do. We've seen that 45 to 54, highest levels of interests. We move on to look at actually a number of different types of activities people are doing. It's a slightly different picture. So those that are actually doing the widest range of activities, and notice this isn't the highest number necessarily, it's the widest range in terms of art forms, is actually the youngest groups. So people are starting off much more sort of widely spread, experimental in their tastes, And as time goes by, they kind of narrow in on particular things they're interested in. So even though for this sort of 45 to 54 group, they've got lots of different things they're interested in practice, they're actually engaging with a smaller range of things than that. The younger group aren't. They're actually engaging on average with a wider range of things than they say they're sort of actively interested in. And again, the older group, it was a little bit lower in terms of engagement. It's actually substantially lower in terms of what they're doing. So interest in what they're doing. So that I think in itself is kind of interesting in terms of the way that different people are behaving. And it starts to emphasize a kind of a bit of a life cycle, or sort of like different stages of life. People are doing different things for different reasons. They're more or less experimental at different stages. They're more or less maybe able to convert their interest into engagement because of other pressures in life and so forth. And so at different points, you see these two factors sort of playing out against each other a little bit differently. So that's our kind of our overview. If there was a small difference before for older people, it's a much bigger difference in terms of actual engagement. There's still, there's pressures on those middle-aged groups, which of course is correlated with having children, but it's not by any means universal. Much more variety and engagement for the younger groups. So if that's our sort of semi-complicated ice cream, then we get to the one with all the full sprinkles. So the number of activities is the number of different art forms attended. Sorry, just to be clear. So it's a number of different of these 16 art forms that people said that they had been to in the last 12 months. One other just little nuance to note, the eagle-eyed amongst you may have spotted that these scales don't actually run to 13 and 16, they run to 12 and 15. That's partly just to make sure that we don't include people who may have just ticked everything, just sort of like just going down all the boxes. We have cleaned the data anyway, but just to be sure that we're not skewing the picture, we've kind of left out those extreme cases. Okay. They don't radically change the picture, in fact, it's just a bit clearer picture. So, does that make sense so far before I move into the next bit? Yeah. So, as well as looking to be started by the proportion of people interested in a particular art form, so that's charted along the bottom here, and the proportion of people who, if they are interested, have attended, and that's the vertical here. So we can look at those things, but we can also break that down to see how it changes by life stage. Oh, sorry, there's a long comment here. Let's make sure I sort of do this. See, so this is from 2012. Love to know. Ooh. Sorry, I just want to...
Yeah, essentially just saying in middle-aged people, is it kind of an accessibility or
yes,
above middle-age, like the accessibility issue in terms of accessibility, like parking and things like that, which we definitely could have an influence. I think it's very interesting.
Yes, and I think what it's flagging is because we've seen such a strong relationship, it probably is something we need to explore further in terms of how those different bits fit together. I think clearly some of it is very much about physical accessibility, and we'll see in a second some really big shifts when you get to 75 plus. But I think, as so often with cultural engagement, interest in the art form or interest in the product is only a bit of the picture, and all the other stuff that goes around it, which could be physical access, it could be geographical access, whether people have moved out into more rural areas. It could also include just habit, routine, whether you've got certain people you tend to go to things with. We've certainly seen post-COVID people saying that the reason they're going less is often about those things being broken. So, habits being broken, or the people you go with no longer being able to go, etc. So it's probably a mixture of all of those, but certainly I think, yeah, it'll be good to be really more specific on some of that stuff. Here we can see if we've got the proportion of people who are interested and the proportion of those who are interested who have attended, we saw that some art forms had really high proportions of both. For example, film. Loads of people are interested in film. Loads of those who are interested actually end up attending. The net result is they end up somewhere up in the top right-hand corner. Whereas, to pick another example, classical music, we saw that a relatively smaller number of people said they were interested or quite interested in classical music, only about 30%. and just under half of those then converted to attendance. So it's a lower level of interest. It's also a lower conversion, and so they end up sort of down left, relatively speaking. So that's the overall picture. We can then split it out by age. So we're going to do that just in the first instance, just for film. And so we can see for this line, it starts in the pale bit at the youngest age category, 16 to 24. And then as you go dot to dot down this line, it goes 25 to 34, 35 to 44, 45 to 54, 55 to 64, 65 to 74, 75 plus. So as you follow that line, you can kind of follow a life course in terms of these age groups. And what we see is, as we'll see in a number of different cases, that over the first few decades, people are often in and around a particular area of this space, and then gradually they hit a point where then the tendency is to head down and to the left, so lower proportions of interest and lower levels of conversion. So both those tending to happen simultaneously. So you go sort of initial phase, and then it will tend down and to the left. And if we put all of these lines on, which admittedly is quite a lot of squiggles, but we'll unpick them one by one, you can see there is a tendency, if you kind of just squint at it a bit, generally speaking, the lines are heading down and to the left. So in most cases, not all cases, but most cases, they're heading down to the left. For example, so we said the other types of music, that kind of browny orange one, which is sort of near the right. So it's a little bit down and to the left overall than film. It's a little less popular than film. It's has a slightly lower level of conversion. But broadly speaking, after some wiggles in the first part, it ends up going quite straight down and to the left as you get into the later age groups. Similarly, dance, you see the green line is really quite starkly down and to the left for most things. Again, there's a little bit of a wiggle at the end of the line there, but we're not talking about huge swings in percentage. We probably shouldn't take those little wiggles as being too strong. The key thing is about the overall shape and direction of that trajectory. We see musicals, the yellow one, following a sort of broadly similar pattern. Where it stands out a little bit in terms of a different picture, and this one will be really obvious in terms of why it's happening like this, is arts for children and families. So people get to the kind of age where they tend to have children and families, and the proportions spike, and so that blue line jags to the right, and then it tails off again down and to the left, and drops off. Yeah, very sort of sharp levels of drop off once you get over 75. So that's the overall picture. We do then have a couple of interesting outliers. So plays and classical music don't seem to drop the proportion of people that are interested in them as they go up by age. They don't necessarily grow, or at least don't tend to grow much. Classical music does a little bit. But what does happen is that the conversion rate, even for people who are interested, does tend to drop with age. So in those cases, it's not so much about interest wanes as interest tends not to convert. So what you're seeing there is then, yes, I think that's what Agnes was just saying. Don't lose interest, they just lose conversion from interest into attendance. And that can be for a variety of reasons, but what seems to be happening, if we look at it in relation to the previous chart, is that we have a sort of a concentration as people get older on really zooming in on the things they most like, or the things they find most convenient, or they kind of get most into the habit of doing. So we've got some of these younger age groups where they're really trying lots of different things. If they try something out the first time, they may well not stick with it, but they're doing lots of different options. As they get further on, if you get sort of picked as an option by someone that you have, and you manage to get into that groove, they could then become quite a long-term attender. And indeed, this doesn't plot how often people are doing things. And I think it's very likely, looking at this, that people are actually doing things more often if they are converting in these instances. So you end up with kind of smaller groups of more regular attendance for many of these categories. Something similar happening with plays, where it tends to drop straight down. And then museums plots its own quite complicated journey. where interest in museums does seem to go up over, from into kind of early middle age. That could be linked to families as well, but then eventually conversion drops, and then in time, both proportion interested and proportion converting drops. So does that make sense as a way of kind of plotting the overall picture about what's happening with people's engagement? What we're trying to do is separate out these two dimensions, rather than just saying we either see people attend or we don't see them attend. And if we see them attend, they were probably interested. And if we don't see them attend, they probably weren't. We're trying to say, actually, there's different things going on that are affecting each of these two different things. And based on that, we can then think about the kind of strategies and tactics we can employ that might, for example, maintain or build interest or enable greater levels of conversion, even if that interest is sort of following that downward trajectory. So now I'm going to hand it over to Anne just to share a few thoughts in reflection to that, and then we can have a bit of a wider conversation about what people have thought. So over to you.
Yeah, actually, I've just changed how I thought I might respond to this. So I think my slot in this little bit of moment, giving you a little bit of time to think of your questions, actually, is to really think about, well, okay, this is great. This is kind of interesting, some interesting trends here, but what do we do about it? For those of us who are working in at the front line and working directly with audiences and organisations. And actually, what I think this highlights for me is a bit of a story about the interplay between interest and need. So actually looking at that again, it's made me think about, so you might be interested in something, but you need a need to motivate you to get up off your cushions and go and do something. So if you took, a simple example about that, I'm interested in classical music, but the need is it's my wife's birthday next week, and we're going to go because I've got to think of something to do with that. And actually, I think you can see that really clearly when you look at the families and young people piece. So small proportion of people interested in family and young people once family work for families and young people, but once you have a big need to entertain those kids and to do useful things with them that aren't about being on their PlayStation and so on. So you've got the interest, but you've got a big motivation in terms of need, and we understand quite a lot about what gets people out and booking for or organising to go and do family-oriented things. So I quite like this idea of thinking about, if we understand that there's quite high levels of interest, how do we meet the need, anticipate and then meet the needs? And actually, I think the reason Ollie asked me to do this was because I was telling him about some work that we've been doing with with a lot of organisations. Actually, there's a particular story from the rather marvellous Nobel Theatre in Copenhagen, who have taken this method and just run with it. It's a method we call audience-centred experience design, and we start with trigger bits of information like this, or some qualitative information, and then we kind of go diving down and say, okay, so let's understand more what we as an organisation could do to respond to that need. So for example, if we took, we have a particular grouping that we found in the Nobel audience. So we had lots of information about how particularly older audiences, those habit-forming older audiences, one of their motivations for not going turned out to be, I don't have anyone to go with anymore. In fact, there was a couple of literals about things like, my husband is really boring and he doesn't like going to the theatre. So there was something about, okay, if we understand that this is somebody who has an interest, but actually their need is quite social. They want to go with somebody, they want to have a social need. And I just wanted to explain the process that Nobel went through. So they did a lot of then talking to older people. They looked at their lapsed attenders, and they surveyed their lapsed attenders and realised that this issue about not having anyone to go with anymore, the person I used to go with is no longer going, or my husband is, I'm more reliant on my boring husband than I was before, became quite a big factor for them. So they then started thinking about, well, how did they respond to that? They realized that the interest isn't enough. They had that social need. So they experimented with a kind of a question around formats. And in fact, they've actually developed, if you'd like to come to my workshop on this, I think we're doing it later on in the autumn, but they did a whole load of new formats, really responding to these different ideas of need. But for that particular group, they really worked on this persona, a woman called Charlotte, in their world now, and really understanding about her needs. And they first of all, they started off doing a sort of a club for people that wanted to go on their own, and they called it, I think they called it the Thursday Club. But they kind of thought, they leapt the idea that making it into a singles club might be a good idea. Well, actually, it turns out that women like Charlotte of a certain age, you know, kind of had no interest whatsoever in having someone. She's got a husband at home. He's just a bit boring. So they kind of got that badly wrong. The idea that your social needs might be about dating just because you're single or you're a single attender. And they gradually over time made, and actually what they do now, they changed the name because Thursday Club didn't mean anything to anybody. And they call it now The Good Company. And they have a lovely sort of a tricycle logo for The Good Company. And in fact, over time, as I say, they really have developed the format. It's very low key. You come along if you want to. There's an area of the theatre that is for The Good Company. Nobody explains to anybody who's not in The Good Company what that means. It just means that you can go and talk, sit next to somebody on your own and chat to people. Of course, people are very open to chatting. There is a social thing afterwards. If you want to join it, you don't have to. They now have a really large cohort of people that come along and do that. And the added bonus that they had not anticipated at all was the level of loyalty that those people have brought to it. So they absolutely, not only are they good advocates, but they're also a massively important related group because they met so closely their needs. They've had this really great relationship with those people. Anyway, I love it as an example of how a kind of quite, actually this started off as quite a statistical trigger, then followed up with some qualitative research, then led to this really important leap forward of format and also this new community that they built. And as I said, they've done quite a few of those. But I don't know, I thought it fitted quite well with this idea of thinking about interest is one thing, need is another. How do we understand and respond to need?
Oh, well, thank you very much, Anne.